Ja, välkommen till Noaks Ark-podden här. Jag är i London på AIDS Impact-konferensen 2019 som följer HIV-frågan ur ett helhetsperspektiv med både fysiologiska och psykosociala aspekter. Och med mig här har jag en av den psykosociala HIV-forskningens stora pionjärer, professor Michael Ross, som är verksam vid Minnesota University i USA. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You had a very, very interesting presentation the other day concerning gender non-conformity in an African context. Could you please tell us a few words about your findings?
Well, it was specifically gender non-conformity in men who have sex with men. And the research we were doing was looking at the discrimination faced by men who have sex with men in Tanzania, in East Africa, where they are heavily discriminated against by healthcare workers, physicians, nurses, and the source of that discrimination, we always thought, was because they were men who have sex with men. And we're talking about overt discrimination, such as being shouted at and abused by the health workers, or refused treatment. But there was a comment I heard at a conference by a very well-educated social worker from Tanzania. And she said to one of my colleagues, why do, she used the term homosexual men, why do homosexual men all want to become women? And this was a shock coming from a very well-educated professional. But it made me think, what is actually the source of the stigma? And so we decided we would look at not only the stigma which men who have sex with men face from health professionals, but we would also look at their level of gender conformity or non-conformity. And by this I mean how masculine or how feminine they rated themselves. And it turned out that most of the discrimination occurred in people, in men who have sex with men who were most feminine. And when we did a somewhat complex multivariate analysis, it turned out that the predictor of discrimination was their degree of gender nonconformity and not whether they were men who had sex with men. And this was not only a surprise, although not a huge surprise, but it suggests that if we're educating health professionals in East Africa, that trying to educate them about men who have sex with men may actually not be the central point. The central point may well be the issue of greater acceptance of gender nonconformity. Now, we also were not sure if people would accurately rate their level of masculinity or femininity.
Yes.
And so we not only asked the men to rate themselves, but we asked the interviewer at the end of the interview to make the same rating of the person. And we found actually there was a very high correlation between the two ratings. So that the men who have sex with men were actually rating themselves quite accurately according to this external rater. So it's surprising how a casual remark by somebody can trigger a piece of research that finds something that's rather surprising.
Sure.
But then when I think about this issue, I think that that we are also partly to blame. We use this, what I call alphabet soup, L, G, B, T, Q, I. I don't know what the latest initials are. But by adding all of these different conditions like trans people and intersex into this, we're suggesting that they all have something diagnostic in common. And so it's maybe not surprising that our colleagues think that LGBTQI and all the rest of it is just really one condition. Which is why I think it's important that we note what they have in common, which is they're all stigmatized sexual minorities, which is a sociological definition and not a medical one. And so I now just use the term SGM, sexual and gender minority, because that indicates that what all of these groups have in common is stigmatization. And it's not a diagnostic label, but it's an observation about the reaction of society.
My experience, at least in Sweden, is that education on these issues is very much focused on sexual preference and the gender of the person you have sex with. But this scale of femininity contra masculinity, it's very seldom brought up to the surface, almost as if it was shameful to talk about these things. As if it was labeling, if you label somebody as feminine or very masculine if it's a lesbian woman.
Yes, and I think you make a very good point. It hasn't been very politically correct to make observations about people's gender role, partly because in the early days of studying gay men, bisexual and lesbian people, that was considered to be a negative stereotype. And so we avoided talking about this negative stereotype because it introduced a criticism, which we know is not valid. The old idea that lesbians are masculine and gay men are feminine was largely culturally determined. But nevertheless, it was not wise to talk about it at one level. But now, I think it's safe to note that, at least in terms of the work in East Africa and maybe other places, that people do negatively react to people who are displaying non-gender normative behaviors, at least in an extreme form.
Very interesting. You've been active you've done lots of studies in the African continent, and these findings. This was happening in Tanzania, where you talk to people in Tanzania. The media in Sweden has reported that since the new president John Magufuli has taken over in Tanzania, that the situation of LGBT people has worsened. What is your impression?
I think that's accurate. It was never a good situation. There was always a series of laws against gay and lesbian or homosexual behavior with major penalties in prison. but he has made it a legitimate target. And so that some governors have gone so far as to ask the public to inform on anybody they know who is gay or lesbian, so that they can be discriminated against in some way. But whether it's actually changed or whether it's simply coming to the surface, I don't know. You might use the analogy about the United States, where maybe racism was always present, but sometimes it takes the person at the top to voice what has not been popular, but has often been under the surface.
You also mentioned to me very high prevalence of HIV infection among men who have sex with men in some African contexts, up to 30%. Was that in Uganda, I believe? No?
No. That was based on our research on men who have sex with men in Dar es Salaam.
Dar es Salaam, yes.
Which is the largest city in Tanzania.
Where you've worked with networks of MSM people, underground networks, could I call them perhaps? That's very interesting.
Yes, we did a study where we looked at Dar es Salaam, which is the largest city of about 4 million, and Tanga, which is a smaller city of about 300,000. The argument was that because of the discrimination, there was no gay community or subculture. But using a network analysis, we were actually able to find quite large networks, connected networks of men who have sex with men in both the large city and the smaller city. So it was very clear that at least for some men who have sex with men, there are good peer networks, because the research was based on respondent-driven sampling, which means people had to recruit other people, and we could trace the networks through that method. So the implication there is that while there may not be a gay community in the Western sense, it would be far too dangerous for men to go to known bars or places. There is an informal network, and the implication is that we can also use peer education, which we know is the most effective education, particularly in stigmatized communities. We can use that to reduce HIV and to pass on HIV knowledge. And when I first started doing the research with men who have sex with men 10 or 15 years ago in Tanzania, it was common for gay and bisexual men to say, we thought you couldn't catch HIV through gay sex because it was never mentioned, and we thought we were safe.
That's amazing.
Well, but that's what happens when you don't mention anything except heterosexual transmission.
That's amazing, truly amazing. And the consequences is very high prevalence of HIV. With peer education, we mean people of similar background are educating each other and supporting each other.
Yes.
And that, you say, is an evidence-based method.
And I can say now that almost every man who has sex with men who we talk with in our current research has been tested for HIV at least once, and often numerous times. But that is anonymous testing, where they don't have to admit what their sexual orientation might be.
You have also talked here and discussed the prevalence of another virus, a sexually transmittable virus, the HPV, in Swedish HPV virus. There's a vaccination for that. In Sweden we vaccinate young girls. We don't vaccinate men and boys against HPV for the moment in Sweden. I'm very curious about would like you to comment on that, the situation with this other virus and what consequences that may have.
Well, we know that various subtypes of HPV will cause cervical cancer in women. What's not commonly known is they can also cause anal cancer in men and women, and oropharyngeal cancer, which is cancer of the back of the mouth, in mostly in men at this point. But it seems strange to me when you have a virus which in women is almost invariably transmitted by men, that you are putting the burden of the vaccination and the responsibility for testing on the women and not on the men. It seems to be very unequal, and it almost seems to be victim blaming, because after all, what about the people who are transmitting HPV to women? Why shouldn't men be vaccinated? Because they are going to most likely be the source of infection for the women. And it makes no public health sense, and it makes no human rights sense.
Thank you very much, Professor Michael Ross.